Hi, I'm Lynn from FromOurBookshelf.com, and I recently did a video and also a blog post on FromOurBookshelf.com about Elisabeth Elliot and the books that she wrote. Elisabeth Elliot is a Christian author, speaker, missionary who wrote over 40 books, and I talked a little bit about her and did a whole post on listing all of her books and the ones I had read and a little bit about each of her books. And in that post and in the video, I mentioned that I was going to do a book review on the biographies that have been done about Elisabeth Elliot. And there's a few recent releases. Today, I am going to review the 2-volume biographies, which is Becoming Elisabeth Elliot by Ellen Vaughn and Being Elisabeth Elliot by Ellen Vaughn. It's a 2-volume set. There is a another biography by Elisabeth Elliot that came out. The author's last name is Austin, is Lucy Austin, and I am currently reading that. I will do a full book review on it when I am finished. I have a lot of thoughts. There are differences in the books and in the writing style. These two by Ellen Vaughn, the Becoming Elisabeth Elliot and Being Elisabeth Elliot, are authorized biographies. Elisabeth Elliot's daughter, Valerie, she had one daughter, shared Elisabeth journals from when she was a child through her entire life, the journals that were available. She shared them with Ellen Vaughn. So Ellen Vaughn had access to Elisabeth's writings and thoughts and to family members that other people have not had. And I really liked how that made these two books more personal, more insight, more of a look into what Elisabeth Elliot really thought and believed. If you are not familiar with Elisabeth Elliot, she was a missionary to Ecuador with her husband Jim. Elisabeth Elliot was born on the East Coast. Jim Elliot was raised in Portland, Oregon, and they met at Wheaton College and became missionaries to Ecuador. After just a short time in Ecuador, Jim and 4 other missionaries, I think there's 5 total, were killed by the tribe they were trying to witness to. And Elisabeth Elliot then stayed and lived with the tribe, witnessed to the tribe. That killed her husband. And she eventually moved back to the States with her daughter Valerie. She eventually got married again. Her second husband died of cancer. She then married a 3rd time. And so these 2 books cover Elisabeth Elliot's life. So let's start with Becoming Elisabeth Elliot. Covers Elisabeth Elliot's life from childhood. So it talks about her childhood, her college years. It talks about dating Jim Elliot, her early years in Ecuador, marrying Jim Elliot, the time period when Jim was killed, and her deciding to then go and live among the tribe that killed her husband. And I think it ends right before she comes back to the States. This was released in 2020, published in 2020. So I read this, I believe, in 2020 or early 2021. So I read this one a couple years ago. But what I liked about this book, actually liked about both, but I'll talk about the second one in a minute, is that this humanized Elisabeth Elliot. She had struggles. There were struggles on the mission field. She struggled with some of her beliefs and figuring out what she believed. And she was opinionated and she was intellectual and maybe a bit strong-willed. I would say she's probably a little bit ahead of her times on some of the things she thought. When she came back from the States, she became a speaker in a kind of the Christian world when there wasn't a lot of women Christian speakers at the time. And she just this book just I humanized her, I guess. It made you realize that she had struggles too. Their life on the mission field was not easy, not just separate from Jim's death. Obviously that was a horrific event, very challenging, but they had challenges with other missionaries and disagreements, and they were human. They weren't super Christians, neither her nor Jim, nor do I think they wanted you to feel like they were. So I really liked how this showed a more personalized version. I've read Elisabeth Elliot wrote a lot about her life and Jim's life and their life on the mission field, but it was fascinating to read about Elisabeth Elliot from someone else, because what we say about ourselves is often different than what other people would say about us. So Ellen Vaughn took her journals, and that's what this book is based on. So I really appreciated this. It showed, like I said, just a little bit different view of Elisabeth Elliot than I had read before. Now, Being Elisabeth Elliot was published last year, so 2023. I loved this one. They both need to be read like together. If you're going to read this one, you need to read the Becoming Elisabeth Elliot first. It'll just make more sense. You could read this as a standalone, but it would make more sense. But I really liked this book. I think Ellen Vaughn, I think this is a little bit better written, even though they're both written by Ellen Vaughn. I've seen an interview and read some things on Ellen Vaughn. She lost her husband to cancer. I think it was in between writing these books or while she was writing this book. And I think that came out in her writing, in the sense that, I don't know, I just thought the writing was a little bit better in this one. There's a lot that will surprise you about this book and actually the Becoming Elisabeth Elliot that I don't want to spoil. I think there's a lot of spoilers out there. There's a lot of people writing and judging Elisabeth Elliot based on this book. And I don't want to give you that opinion. I want you to read this book if you're an Elisabeth Elliot fan and see what you think based on what you read. I don't want to tell you what I think, I guess, on that, as far as that goes, because you will learn a lot about Elisabeth Elliot that you didn't know. She didn't always stand by her own, she wasn't perfect. And with her dating her second husband, and even somewhat her third husband, she didn't follow necessarily her own rules that she wrote in Passion and Purity. She was not a perfect Christian. And I mean, I never thought she was, but she wasn't a perfect Christian. She was not a super Christian. She was a sinner saved by grace, just like the rest of us. And this portrays her as a human and with flaws and trying to live in a fallen world. I think what came out in this book to me is she was raised in a very conservative, what would be considered now fundamentalist, probably background, with a lot of rules and that she was expected to follow. And I think when she came back to the mission field, she really started to work through some of that. And this comes out in that book. And her really deciding what she believed. I think her second husband was like her intellectual equal. They had this partnership that wasn't just love-based, it was spiritual-based, and it was intellectual-based. They challenged each other. And when she lost her second husband, it was devastating in a different way than when she lost Jim Elliot in Ecuador. And I found that fascinating, because I think we can understand Elisabeth Elliot better by reading her books and knowing she wasn't perfect. She was a sinner. She struggled with working through some of her beliefs, some of what others believed, some of how others treated her. She, like I said, she was definitely opinionated. She was a Christian speaker in a world that was dominated by men, especially when she came back from the mission field. One of the books she wrote early on was, I believe it's called No Graven Image. I have it on Kindle. I have not read it yet. And it was a novel she wrote when she came back from Ecuador, a few years, I think, after she came back from Ecuador. And it was not based on her life, but a lot of what happened to her on the mission field and in Ecuador, she used those experiences to write the book, No Graven Image. And that book was not well received because people did not think that she gave an accurate view of the mission field and the mission work and what it was like. And she felt like she did. And she stood by that, even though that book was not well received. So I think she definitely stood by her opinions more, maybe in her younger years. I think in her later years, she wrote for her audience. She wrote for that Christian audience. And I don't know that she always 100% believed what she wrote. She wrote for an audience. And I think her third husband influenced that. And I'm not going to say a whole lot more, except that she was not necessarily who we all thought she was. And I think that's okay. This book, and actually both of them, The Becoming and The Being Elisabeth Elliot, made me appreciate Elisabeth Elliot more. I know a lot of people, a lot of Christians that love Elisabeth Elliot have come away from reading these saying they judged Elisabeth Elliot, they're disappointed in Elisabeth Elliot. I don't feel that way. These two books helped me understand Elisabeth Elliot. They helped me sympathize with Elisabeth Elliot. They helped me even more think Elisabeth Elliot understands what it's like to live as a Christian in a fallen, sinful world, and to struggle through what we believe, and to struggle through the intellect, and to struggle through what the world looks like around us, and how we should live for Christ in that world. And I'm not saying I love her books. I'm going to continue to read her books. I've never agreed 100% with what Elisabeth Elliot said. I talked about that more in my previous video where I talked about her books. I've never agreed 100% with her, but I think there's a lot to be gleaned from her work, even if you don't agree with her 100%. And like I said, this book just humanized her. It made me feel like I understand her. Except don't want to give any spoiler words. I wish this would make an excellent, actually both of them, Christian book club book. I feel like I need to start a nonfiction Christian book club just so we could discuss this book with other people like my age that have loved Elisabeth Elliot for years. There is so much to discuss in this book. And like I said, I don't want to give spoilers. I will just say, yeah, I think I'd said it before. She's not exactly what you thought she was. Her third marriage was definitely not what most people thought it was. And I think and I hope that these two books will give you a greater appreciation for Elisabeth Elliot. She went through some difficulties. I think some of her best writing is on pain and suffering. And she knew what pain and suffering and sorrow were like, and the loneliness, and how that should force us to Christ and draw us to Him. So except if you're an Elisabeth Elliot fan, I hope you'll enjoy these books. I hope it'll make you appreciate Elisabeth Elliot more and not judge Elisabeth Elliot. I hope it'll make you feel like she understood. She understood what we're going through, what we've been through, and the struggles of living for Christ in this world. So for more book reviews, I do Sunday reading posts once a month, twice a month on FromOurBookshelf.com. I have more information about these two books, Becoming Elisabeth Elliot and Being Elisabeth Elliot by Ellen Vaughn. I have a whole list of books by Elisabeth Elliot, and you can find all of that at FromOurBookshelf.com.